It's very hard to justify voting for Trump on any moral ground for anyone.
Really?
I mean, I think he gets support from people who are worried about their future.
Right. Do you feel that the Indian Americans perceive that Trump will be better for India rather than Harris? Do you feel that they perceive that?
I think they do. The question is how much it matters to them.
What's your view on the election, not just pertaining to Indian voters? What's the climate looking like right now?
I think it's tough for Harris to win.
Really?
Trump has his dedicated voter base that's going nowhere. She is not that impressive as a candidate, in my opinion.
Do you think that the majority of Americans prefer a very aggressive Israel?
So, one is that I don't think the war will continue beyond the election, the American election.
We're inching closer to November and to one of the most important global political events of the year, the US presidential election. The Harris-Trump battle is taking place in the backdrop of an escalating war in West Asia, which has ramifications for the entire world, including India. How does a rising power like India fit into this entire complex equation? How will American Indians vote in the upcoming election, and what impact will the results have on Indo-U.S. bilateral ties? Can India play a positive role in de-escalating the conflict in the Middle East? To answer all these important and interconnected questions, we have with us on Buzz by the Bay senior economist from the reputed research organization RAND and former director of Stanford University's Center for South Asia, Dr. Rafiq Dossani. Welcome to Buzz by the Bay. Pleasure to have you on the show. So you're of course, you're originally from Kolkata and Mumbai.
That's right, yes.
But you live in Los Angeles now.
Now I live in Los Angeles, yes.
Okay.
For some years now, about a dozen years.
But you make frequent trips to India.
Very frequent. I look after in the work that RAND does in India. So that brings me here, I would say 3 to 4 times a year.
Okay. Look after the work RAND does in India as in?
So the work that RAND does in India is, RAND is very multidimensional. Pretty much any field of public policy is covered by RAND. It's huge. It has 2,000 employees, of whom half are research staff. Whether it's national security, diplomacy, education, healthcare, infrastructure, RAND does it.
Not just national security. Everybody wants to talk about national security. I suppose that's a very appealing topic for the media, but things like healthcare and all get sidelined.
Yeah.
Your area of research is with mainstreaming.
Mine is become more eclectic than it used to be. My research has spanned China, Southeast Asia at large, South Asia, and I cover various fields. I look at technology, I look at politics, I look at national security issues, education, not so much on health myself. And then of course lately I've been working on a project within the US and looking at the mainstreaming of migrant communities who are largely Asian.
So mainstreaming as in how like a minority or ethnic group assimilates into a culture.
Yes, so it's kind of interesting that assimilation was viewed as sort of the gold standard. So every migrant group in America tried to become like the dominant community, hoping maybe in the process to influence it just a little bit so that in their direction, so they wouldn't lose their culture fully. But in fact, the data show that by the 3rd generation, your original culture is gone. And you're fully mainstream in the sense that the majority community accepts you into their institutions, their schools, into political participation, civic life, intermarriage, social discourse, and so on. But that story has not been the same for every migrant community. It worked very well for European migrants till the 1950s.
Yeah.
When the Asian migrant wave started, it was more difficult. There was a color issue, obviously.
So you're saying America is a far less pluralistic society?
It's not at all a pluralistic.
Not at all. So people kind of assimilate, they adopt the dominant culture. Instead, they lose their own.
They lose their own. So it's a kind of a conformist society. And for many cases, the immigrants may want this. I'm not saying it's forced on them. But by and large, the evidence now is showing that they're uncomfortable with it. And many are actually trying to go back. So you have communities that say, all right, we're mainstream, but let's look a little bit at where we came from.
Interesting. My impression would be that, Indians, at least a lot of Indian Americans, maintain quite a lot of their traditions, some religious customs,
Yes.
some sort of...
Yeah, it has some political aspects as well.
Yeah.
Traditionally, Indian Americans have voted Democrat. But as you look at, that's at the national level. But if you look at the local level, it's far more heterogeneous. You'll have business communities in Texas. There are many such, convenience stores, dry cleaners, small businesses where their interaction is with other people who like them, who supply them with goods. These are typically church-going Republicans whom they're dealing with. They'd go out with them to have a drink of beer, a beer in the evening, and slowly they become Republicanized in a sense. So, So I know people who vote Republican in the local election, whereas otherwise their buddies or their mates will look down on them, but who vote Democratic in the national election.
In the national election. Yeah. So I was coming to that. US election, all eyes on that, because it's going to have implications for conflicts that are going on in the world, especially with the widening conflict in West Asia, as I mentioned in my introduction. Now that is dominating the headlines everywhere, and it is a matter of great concern for, in terms of national security, also in terms of oil prices, gas prices, economies. It's a huge, it has huge ramifications all around. But first I want to talk about the US elections and Indian voters. So you said, that they have mainstreamed into American society, into American culture, and yes, in evidence of this mainstreaming or proof of this mainstreaming is Kamala Harris becoming the presidential candidate from the Democratic Party. I mean, she is biracial, right? Father Jamaican, mother from India, of Indian origin. So I mean, to me, that's a huge example of mainstreaming. I mean, how it's actually going to play out, we don't know, and I'm going to ask you that. But both sides, Republicans and Democrats, are actively, aggressively wooing the Indian community. Would you say that it's a very important vote bank? Because I mean, AAPI data shows that there are over 2.1 million eligible Indian American voters, and that Indian voters have the highest voting rates of any Asian American group.
So I think the Indian American community is interesting to politicians because one, it's wealthy. Second, it's they tend to work in groups, so that they're very collectivist in their thinking rather than individualist. So wooing an opinion leader gets you the vote of many others. So that's a second reason that they're important. And third is there's a recognition that very quickly Indians in the last 20 years have gone from outsiders to insiders.
Okay.
How many CEOs now do we know of Indian origin? There must be several dozen of good companies, important companies. But of course one should realize that much of this is geopolitical. In the sense that 20 years back, it was the Chinese who were the model community.
Right.
A mantle that the Indians have taken on now.
Okay.
And they were a model community because America's relations with China were excellent. And that all has changed. Now, if you're Chinese in America, you're always worried.
Really?
Yeah, because you're being demonized right, left and center. I have students at the Pardee and graduate school who are Chinese. They're very scared all the time.
But demonized why?
Well, the China initiative that Trump had,
yes.
When he spoke out during COVID.
Yes.
So all these latent, fears that the dominant community had came to the surface, and they started othering them. I mean, so you can see the status of Chinese Americans sort of tracks that of China-US relations.
Right.
So India-US relations are at a high.
Right.
I'm just saying, be careful, it's not permanent necessarily.
It's not permanent, right? You're saying it's geopolitical, it really depends on the bilateral ties between two countries. So right now, Indians are the model citizens.
Right.
But would you say they're really actively wooed by both parties more than other ethnic groups?
Well, they're doing it in a number of ways. One is having Indian Americans run for office on Democrat or Republican tickets. And that's been very successful at drawing the Indian voter. But the other way is really trying to listen to their interests.
Right.
Which is not always an easy thing to do when you've got such a heterogeneous community. I mean, you know.
Now coming to a study that I read. So during the 2020 elections, a study by Carnegie Endowment has stated that the data shows that Indian Americans continue to be strongly attached to the Democratic Party with little indication of a shift towards the Republican Party. Fast forward to 2024, there's a survey by AAPI, Nikkei.com, and it says data indicates a drop in the percentage of Indian Americans identifying as Democrats from 54% in 2020 to 47% in 2024. Those identifying as Republicans rose from 16% to 21% in the same time frame. Additionally, Harris's favorability among Indian American voters has declined from 62% in 2022 to 54% in 2024. So this survey was taken in July before Harris's candidacy was announced.
Yeah.
Now that her candidacy is announced, would you say there could be a shift?
I think so. I sense it. There's this wave of support from the Indian American community that Kamala Harris for her.
You're sensing it?
Yes, for sure. So the Indian American community will rally behind her. You know, these statistics, as I mentioned to you, there are people I know who are Republican at home and Democrat nationally. A lot of that is going on. Those who in business hate paying high taxes, or they hate the idea of paying reasonable taxes also.
Yeah.
So Trump's, what he did for rich people appealed to that group. In fact, one person I remember telling me, I told him, you can't vote for Trump this time around, Indian entrepreneur in Atlanta, and he said, I know, but still, thinking of his pocketbook. Yeah.
Thinking of his pocketbook.
Yeah.
So he said, so maybe like in terms of in social issues or morally he felt he can't, but then economically, financially, it suits him more as a business.
It suits him more. It's very hard to justify voting for Trump on any moral ground for anyone.
Really?
I mean, I think he gets support from people who are worried about their future.
Right. So I was thinking, what do you make of this data, of this shift from in support towards the Republican Party? Yes, still a majority is with the Democrats. But what do you make of this data? It's largely because of taxes, right? Indian businessmen, of course, sharp businessmen, they care about, their taxes and their bottom line, so that's going to make a difference. But also this sort of perceived camaraderie between Trump and Modi, Trump also plays that up, like, okay, Modi ji, Prime Minister Modi is my good friend, and clearly, there is support for Modi ji amongst the Indian diaspora and the U.S. From what I've seen and visits to the U.S., huge stadiums get filled and all that. So they like this idea of this Trump and Modi friendship. So that's also one factor that could be pulling them towards the Republicans. What do you think?
I think that's a very interesting question. There are Indians who, as you point out, for tax reasons, they like the Republican Party. But so in some sense, I think it's quite remarkable that they've stayed with the Democrats all this time, while they themselves have moved up so sharply in income. Their behavior in that sense is different from the white community's behavior at that same income level.
It's different from?
Yeah, because they're more democratic than their white counterparts.
Okay.
So if you take a CEO of a typical Fortune 500 company who's white, chances are he votes, or she votes, mostly a he, I guess, votes Republican.
Okay.
Indian Americans are not that way. So in that sense, they've kept to their roots better.
Okay.
It hasn't crumbled in the face of mainstreaming, as they become wealthy. Now, that's one segment. They have that segment which is also very nationalistic about India, although sitting in the United States. So their idea of supporting India's development is to support, a prime minister who has good relations with the world, and certainly Mr. Modi qualifies in that regard. He's been able to develop good relations with world leaders all over.
But you said something interesting. You said on moral grounds you cannot justify voting for Trump.
Yeah, what I mean is that, you know, if I take China as an example, to demonize a whole country of 1 billion plus people and then Chinese Americans after that is completely unacceptable. You know.
Yeah. Yes, but so you maintain that from your assessment of things that Harris is getting a lot of support from the Indian Americans.
Yes.
That she is swinging. What about people who've sort of shifted over to Republicans? You think they might shift back to Democrats because Harris is a candidate?
So again, those who are very patriotic or nationalistic about these things may not, because they don't necessarily see Kamala Harris as helping India's cause.
Okay.
Trump is seen as more likely to be a friend of India than Harris, right? Because Harris made these statements earlier.
Yes.
But I think for your typical mainstream Indian American voter, foreign policy is not that much of an issue as belonging within the country.
Right, right.
So Kamala Harris to them is an example of someone who is totally mainstreamed.
Right.
You know, if you look at her Indian heritage, she's married into a black family, so traditional minority but very American, moved ahead in in white society and politics. So all these together, it forms, particularly for the younger American Indian, I found very attractive.
They're attractive.
That's very attractive, the package.
Yes. Do you feel that do you feel that the Indian Americans perceive that Trump will be better for India rather than Harris? Do you feel that they perceive that?
So I think they do. The question is how much it matters to them.
Okay, but why do they perceive that?
They perceive that because they observed under Trump how close the relationship became.
Yeah.
And you know, in some ways, personality-wise, both are larger than life figures. So it sort of fits in, you know.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for a larger than life leader, you want a Trump and a Modi, you know.
Right, right.
And if you want, and they showed that they could get along. So.
What's your view on the election, not just pertaining to Indian voters? What's the climate looking like right now?
I think it's tough for Harris to win.
Really?
Trump has his dedicated voter base that's going nowhere. She is not that impressive as a candidate, in my opinion.
Really?
Yeah, I've heard her speeches. It's sort of a package of a few things that very carefully done.
Yeah.
There's no spontaneity that shows through. You know, she said, "I'll take care of you." You know, things that her campaign staff have primed her on. So I'm not that Trump is a great campaigner; he's terrible. But you know, he has his base that doesn't care what he's about.
Right.
Whereas Kamala's base does care what she's about, so it makes it a little more difficult for her. I don't think those votes will go to Trump, but they might abstain. The voter turnout might be the problem.
Really? So you think voter turnout might take a hit?
Yeah, for sure. You can see it in the black community already.
Really? So the black community is not, there's no overwhelming support for Kamala in the black community?
It's quite divided. Many of the black community view Trump as having done more for them in his term because of the trade tariff barriers on Chinese goods and so on. They think that protected their jobs. So many unionized factories, the members will vote for Trump.
Okay, so the black community is very divided. So it is looking tough for her.
Yeah, I think it's tough for her.
You think we're headed for another Trump presidency?
No, I don't know. I think it's too close to call.
Too close to call?
I mean, no one should lose to Trump. You know, I mean, Hillary Clinton just botched it so badly. She is the only person who could have lost to Trump.
How did she botch it? Because
of her terrible campaigning style. There was no content. She would appear wooden. People just said that we want someone fresh. This one looks stale, you know.
Okay.
And Harris, fortunately, will not come with that problem, but she may botch it up in other ways.
Oh God, this is looking very bleak to me. Because I mean, it is the most important global political event, the most important election, right? The U.S. election.
Well, yes and no. I mean,
it has global ramifications.
Well, if I ask you now, how many initiatives of peace have succeeded in Biden's term? What would you say? 0, right? 4 years of Trump.
Yeah.
Where, for whatever it was, nothing bad happened internationally, except that China got, played around with. But, it didn't cause any wars. And now, how many wars is America fighting or get involved in? The Middle East, as an arms supplier, as a negotiator. Obviously, Ukraine, Russia.
Yeah.
Obviously, Taiwan. Anything that happens there, they're going to be deeply involved. So what you're seeing is a very different America than one would perceive 4 years ago.
Trump was less of a warmonger or less aggressive on that
Less
front.
aggressive warmongering, and he's not that, like, I think Biden's followed this very hyper competitive policy, with, like, banning this good and that item from export to China. It's like crazy the amount of things that he's done. He's gone well beyond Trump,
Coming to the situation in West Asia, the Middle East. I mean, at the time of recording, from the, till the time we actually air this interview, it's possible that there'll be even more changes in the situation. Does US policy in the Middle East actually make a difference to voters?
So one is whether it makes a difference to the conflict, and the other is the question whether it makes a difference to the voters.
Yeah.
My opinion is on the first one, it doesn't really.
Who? The presidential
The US
candidate.
policy is kind of fixed on Israel.
Right.
And doesn't matter who's in power. And it's made like that in part because the voters don't really care. From their point of view, if you paint, it's painted as we're getting rid of the terrorists. Iran is, a terrorist group. And by the way, this has follow-on effects on countries like India. But I think the average voter really doesn't think beyond, if he does even that, think beyond the borders of the country.
Doesn't think beyond the borders of the country. So what they do in West Asia doesn't matter. It might matter to the Jewish population.
So, where it mattered was in 73 and 79, 1979, when US oil and gas production was not that much.
Okay.
Now the US is self-sufficient. It's the world's largest producer of gas. So that energy imperative has gone away.
Okay.
So therefore their interest in the Arab countries has gone away. Now, yes, you're right that Jewish Americans have great sympathy for Israel's cause.
Right.
And they should. I mean, so the Arab Americans have for the other side, or Iranian Americans for Iran. The problem is they just don't have the clout of the Jewish Americans in influencing policy. So the result is, clout creates...
Clout.
Yeah.
Money matters, clout matters, of course.
Good old American...
Good old American values.
Values, yeah. Searching for that word.
But I heard an interesting theory the other day. I mean, it's... this theory basically said that Netanyahu feels emboldened to continue the war because that will help Trump win. He would rather have Trump than Kamala Harris. He would rather have a Trump because, of course, Biden is his great friend. But now Biden's not going to be standing from the Democrat ticket. So he basically is leaning, it would benefit Netanyahu more to have Trump in power. Do you feel that?
No, I don't.
You don't?
I think because American policy is set.
It's set.
It's not something that a Trump or a mere president can affect. It's a long-term decision that was made by the strategists behind the scenes as to what that policy should be. And it strongly includes supporting Israel no matter what, because they see Israel as being, in a sense, America's representative in the Middle East. Now, not everything the rep does is to your liking, but mostly it is,
Yeah.
So even bombing of Iran's facilities, I mean, given how much the US has broken off with Iran and accuses it of all the time, it's not something that US policymakers at a deep level really care about, or really worry about. In fact, they think the reverse, that it's a good thing.
It's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, the way I can see it, it seems that Israel is following a well thought out plan. I don't know what that plan is or where it ends up. But they're doing things without any worry from what the world might say.
So is it going to get much worse before it gets better, the situation?
So I don't know the plan. So I doubt that it will go beyond bruising Iran. Where else will they go? After Iran, there's nothing left, no? Syria maybe.
Yeah, but what if, other countries get involved, and what if the US takes on Iran directly?
That they won't do. I don't think the US is
There has been talk, you one listens
yeah.
to interviews and reads articles and op-eds, and there's all these sort of theories floating around and all these hypothetical situations floating around.
But do they need to? I mean, if Israel is there, they'll do what's necessary.
Yes, I guess. I mean, of course, you would know much better than me. Do you think that a majority of Americans prefer a very aggressive Israel?
So, one is that I don't think the war will continue beyond the elections, the American elections. Israel, I think, is speeding up, in a sense, what it wants to do, so that it gets out of the way. It's Biden's problem, not inherited by Trump or Harris.
Okay.
That's my sense of it. Otherwise, I can't explain the speed with which they've moved into Lebanon, done things to Iran. So if that is the case, then it's not going to be a problem for either president, whoever's elected. Now, that being said, your question also is: does the average American voter care, right? And as we discussed, I think they don't. By and large, if at anything, I mean, many are supportive. Those with background in those countries or other places are against it. Now in Delhi, when I was there last week, I heard from several influential bureaucrats and ex-bureaucrats that they're really upset at America.
Oh.
You see, I mean, the thing is that India is suffering a lot from these events, right? The Ukraine war. I had one foreign secretary, I mean, within the Ministry of External Affairs, tell me, that when Venezuelan oil was sanctioned by the U.S., India lost about $1 billion because they set up 4 refineries just to process that particular kind of oil. And it was suddenly shut down. The same thing happened with Iranian oil. So, they're saying sanctions, the US doesn't get affected because it's got the resources. But what about us,
Yeah, of course. It affects us a lot.
So then when that happens, then they tend to look at the Israel-Gaza conflict with slightly different eyes,
So you're saying a lot of these former bureaucrats said that...
and current,
and current bureaucrats said they're kind of upset with America.
Yes.
For what? For not implementing a ceasefire? For not...
Well, they think correctly that American weapons make the big difference in the war.
Yeah.
And they feel that the supply of these weapons is something that America can use to control the pace of the war.
Of course.
And that by choosing not to do so, and in fact saying that if Iran retaliates, we'll go in the defense of Israel fully as a country.
Yeah.
They're doing the wrong thing, according to these people.
According to these, can you name these bureaucrats?
No.
I just thought I'd ask anyway. I took a chance. But that's very interesting that you say that. Of course, the arms supply to Israel, if that stops or slows down, that'll make a big impact. But that's never going to happen, right? I mean, never. There's too many vested interests in that.
Yeah. I mean, it's part of long-term policy, I think.
It's very sad. But I'm glad that there are bureaucrats who are kind of thinking that way in India, who are seeing the light, who realize that this is not really benefiting us. Because, a lot of people look at war as an opportunity in many ways. And this question was asked to External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar just a couple of days ago. And he said, no, this is not an opportunity. This is actually very detrimental to us because oil prices, shipping prices, insurance prices, everything. It's just not benefiting us at all.
Yeah, just the risk level being high, there's possibility of escalation, right?
Yes, absolutely.
If you get escalation, then you're in deep trouble.
Of course, we're in deep trouble. But you're saying that you think by the time the elections come round, this will be done with?
Yes.
Really?
My prediction.
Your prediction. That's a big prediction to make because that's like 5th of November, the election. That's less than a month away. So it'll be done with. And how will it be done with?
I think whatever they want to do with Iran is probably the last. I don't see anything else that they need to do.
But what will they do with Iran?
Well, the talk is that they might, destroy the port facilities so that Iran can't ship oil out.
Right.
That's one. They may, that underground nuclear thing, whatever that is, take that out.
Right.
So I think these are the 2 big targets right now.
Coming to India's role in this and the US-India bilateral ties. So, US professes to be a good cop, which it's not. It hasn't done anything really to de-escalate any
Yeah, the
tension.
US defines good cop as not being a bad cop.
While India, does things that US may not approve of, like stay friends with Iran,
And Russia.
and Russia, good ties with Russia, buy Russian oil, get oil from Iran as well. US had warned of, back in May earlier this year, US had warned of potential sanctions for any country considering business deals with Iran. And hours after that they issued that warning, India signed a 10-year contract to operate a port with Tehran, the Chabahar port. So, we are developing ports together. We have diplomatic ties, right? The Iranian ambassador to India said a couple of days ago that I would like India to use its influence to de-escalate, to put some pressure on Israel or use its influence with Israel to help de-escalate tensions. I don't know if he was just saying that because he felt he should say that being an Indian Iranian ambassador to India, but I mean, how is this going to play out with India's ties maintained with Iran?
So India's foreign policy, as I see it, is in pursuit of its vision of a multipolar world, where India is one of the poles.
Okay.
So they accept that China will be one, America will certainly be the one. But so at least these three poles should be there. So in pursuit of that vision, having good ties with everyone is a plus.
Right.
Now, and India has learnt its lesson, I think, from its immediate neighborhood, South Asia, where it's had very difficult ties, sometimes good, sometimes really bad. Yeah. And it seems to be learning that the only way to really do it is to behave well with everyone.
So this, Dr. Jaishankar has referred to as a multi-vector foreign policy. Cultivating good relations with set of countries that are hostile to each other, dealing with them on a non-exclusive basis, countries that are rivals. So you feel that this is the right policy for India?
Yeah, I think it makes sense for India at this time of its geopolitical evolution.
Yeah.
I don't see it as without risk, because if you have friendly ties, when you have a big player like India dealing with small countries, there's a tendency to do more than just maintain good ties. There's a tendency to maintain good ties with a particular leader, as we saw in Bangladesh, and to some extent in Maldives as well, that it can backfire on you.
Right.
Bangladesh, the reputation of India is in tatters at the moment. The feeling is that India didn't care about Bangladesh, they cared about Sheikh Hasina, because they thought she'd been in power forever, so in exchanging favors.
Right. Okay. So, but this is our policy and we will continue relations with Iran, but will that anger America?
India is not going to push America on that for some time. So if they do it, they'll do it with American permission.
This is a very delicate balance from what I understand. And given this whole situation.
So, if I may just go back to your earlier question about multi-vector policy, I think where India has not done well is in its neighborhood. In most cases, countries become great powers by moving from being regional powers to sort of bigger region like an ocean and then global. That's how the U.S. first sort of got the rest of the Americas in line.
Yeah.
Then moved out. Japan similarly, Germany similarly during their times. But India, having failed in its region in a sense, have a viable, thriving region, mainly because of India-Pakistan issues, has jumped to being like a regional power, aspiring for global power status. Now, my view is you can't do the second and third unless you've properly cleaned up the situation at home.
Understood.
Which requires a much more gentle hand, of policy making. You have to be able to now engage in public diplomacy, people to people, or government to people, to convince them that you've really changed.
Okay, so public diplomacy, people to people diplomacy is what is needed. So you're saying until India gets its act together in the South Asian region, it cannot have a wider impact.
Wider influence, that's right.
So you've done research on this middle powers, and India is a rising middle power. What is a middle power, if you can explain?
Sure. So there are great powers and there are small powers. Great powers are those that can affect the course of international relations, either to disrupt it or to push it in a certain direction. Small powers have no influence. In between them, there's a category called middle powers who have some influence but not enough to disrupt the system. So they play by the rules of the great powers but can do things that the great powers either choose not to do or cannot do. For example, Canada has long been prized its status as a middle power. It promoted the UN peacekeeping force. In the 1990s, India was not a middle power. It became one through the 1990s because of the decline of the traditional middle powers, the Europe countries, Japan, and the rise, and this India along with few others, South Africa, Brazil, Malaysia, Turkey for sure, have improved their status in terms of their ability to influence outcomes. Now, if you ask concretely what outcomes has India influenced, certainly you can say they've been able to help Sri Lanka in recent years.
Yes.
I think they tried very hard on Afghanistan but didn't finally get anywhere because the Taliban came back.
Yeah.
Overall, I think one of the problems with middle powers is that they're often ineffective because the political space is taken up by the greater power. The US, if you say US is the biggest power and China is the second, they're both competing everywhere. So it ends up being a US-China story with very little role for India. For example, India was not consulted, I believe, on anything to do with the Ukraine-Russia conflict. India feels bad about that, but that's the reality. Maybe Russia and the US is where India has really good relations with both. But it could do something, but the US has to want it.
Right. So basically, coming back to West Asia and the Middle East conflict, you don't think India can have any influence?
I think, it's marginal.
Marginal.
What will it tell Israel that Israel will listen to?
That's true.
We'll say, please don't bomb Iran because we have civilizational contact with them.
How do you see India's role in the world playing out now over the next 10 to 15 years?
So I see it growing. I don't see it receding. I see it growing at a slow pace. I really hope that the neighbourhood will be the first point of attention. If it is, then if you have, Pakistan is going to be difficult for various reasons, but if you have Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, that Sri Lanka, Maldives and Afghanistan are kind of lined up. It's not a big deal, but India now has the resources, just has to have the right attitude.
The right attitude.
Yeah, one Nepalese politician whom I had interviewed some time back told me that we want, it's a bit sexist, okay? He said, we want India to be the big sister, the nourishing sort, the welcoming sort, saying, tell me your problem, not the big brother that keeps beating you.
All right, got it. Understood. So you feel that India should first sort out its relations in its own neighborhood and then increase its influence globally. And you think that will happen?
It will happen if India wants it to happen. I think there is the question of ambition as well. China knows it has a voice in Southeast Asia because it's big, so it can afford to bully them all the time.
Yeah.
And it does that.
Okay.
So we don't want in India going that way.
All right. So we don't want an India going the China way. We want an India that is
the big sister.
The big sister. The big sister with a positive influence.
Yes.
Right. Thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us, Dr. Dossani. It was a pleasure to have you on Buzz, by the way.
My pleasure. Thank you.